Good evening. Welcome to Boldmethod Live. Today we're going to talk about 3 common questions we're getting as the weather outside is getting colder. I'm Alex Udris. I'm a Boldmethod co-founder. I'll be presenting tonight. My business partner, Colin Cutler, he's our producer, and tonight he's managing chat as well. The entire point of a live presentation is that it can be interactive, and so all throughout this, if you want me to go into more detail on any of these areas, if I start to lose you, if you think more should be added in, shout that out in chat. And then Colin will work that into the presentation as we go. Don't wait till the end, otherwise the show isn't very interactive. Okay, so again, I said we're looking at the 3 most common questions that we're getting right now, either through your feedback or through email, stuff we're seeing across Instagram, and they all seem to have to do with the fact that it's getting a little bit colder outside. So the first one we're going to look at has to do with how we would change our final approach and landing speeds with the colder weather. Number 2, we're going to look at why it's so hard to start a carbureted engine as the weather gets colder. And then number 3, we're going to look at the braking action reports that have been around for a couple years now. We're going to look at what they mean and where we're going to find them and how to actually read and use them. And Colin, why don't you lead us off with our first question?
Okay, perfect. So here is our first question, and it's this. With colder temps and lower density altitude this time of year, should I fly final approach at a slower speed?
Okay, I say it way too much, but this is always a really good question. We get this question.
Someone just said that on chat too.
All the time with temperature. We get it with altitude. We get it with all kinds of things. How should you adjust your final approach speed? And really, I think one of the problems is we have an indicated airspeed, an airspeed indicator. And really, there's no term for that other than indicated airspeed. It doesn't really relate to what's going on outside. But one of the things that you could really think about is, in a way, it's a density compensating airspeed system. That's really what you have. And the short answer is that your airspeed indicator is automatically going to compensate for the higher density of air as the air gets colder. And so you're going to fly the exact same final approach speeds that you would normally fly in warm weather, high density altitude, low density altitude. So the rule we're talking about today, it obviously applies when the weather's getting colder or warmer, but it also applies if you're flying into a high density altitude airport. If you're used to flying into Hays, Kansas, and you come up to Denver, Colorado, or you go down to San Francisco, all of these completely different density altitudes, but your final approach speeds really don't change. And that's because they're not affected. Your indicated airspeed system essentially is telling you how the airplane feels like it's flying. So while it's affected by density altitude, the readings that you get, they're automatically compensating so that you just fly your normal speeds. We'll take a look at how that works here. We're going to jump over to the iPad. Okay, so we have a Cirrus here, but this is typical of any light aircraft's pitot-static system. So, and even as you get into turbine aircraft, these rules are going to apply. So what you can see down here on the wing, this is our pitot tube. That's one half of the equation. And then this metal thing surrounded by a circular dial or a red circle, that's our static port or a static source. And essentially this right here, the static source, is going to detect the ambient or static air pressure. The pitot tube is going to detect total air pressure. Some people call this ram air pressure, but essentially it's a combination of static. So when we're sitting on the ground, it's still sensing that outside static air pressure. But then as we start moving, it's sensing both static and then what we call dynamic air pressure. Okay, so to recap, again, static air pressure is just that outside normal air pressure. When they say, the outside altimeter is 29.92, that's your static air pressure. When they give you an altimeter setting, by the way, that's not the actual outside air pressure. That's the outside air pressure then calibrated down to sea level. So, in Denver, they may say something like 29.92, but if you actually take a barometer out there, you're going to notice it actually reads about 24 inches. And that's because, again, we're getting a sea level altimeter setting. Your static system is actually going to sense your actual, 24 inches of, here in Denver, outside air pressure. And if you've ever flown a constant speed, controllable pitch airplane, so you've got a manifold pressure gauge, when the power's off and you look at that gauge, you'll notice it always registers something. That right there is the static air pressure inside the system. Okay, so that works to tell us how high we are. When we talk about dynamic air pressure, that's the air pressure that happens due to movement or forward movement. The problem that we run into is that our pitot tube is always sensing them both. So what happens is, if we take a look, pitot tube, it's going to pull up total pressure. Then we pipe in the static ports. That takes that total pressure back just a little bit. And then we get what we call indicated airspeed. So that airspeed is calibrated to read accurately, or really true airspeed, on a standard day and at sea level. That's the only time your airspeed indicator is actually going to tell you how fast you're really flying. At sea level, on a standard day. As soon as you start to change the outside air pressure, so you either climb or descend, or the air pressure itself changes, or you start to change the temperature. So essentially now you're changing the density altitude so that you're no longer at sea level. Okay? As soon as you start to do that, that indicated airspeed is no longer going to be true airspeed. It's really just a measurement of how much air is impacting the pitot tube. So it's measuring the mass of air that's impacting the pitot tube. The reason that's so important is because your wings really don't care how fast you're flying either. They just care about the mass of air that is moving over and below your wings. That's what generates lift. That's what generates control pressures. So as long as they see the same mass of air, they don't care whether they're flying at sea level or at 10,000 feet. So again, essentially when we talk about landing speeds or takeoff speeds, stall speeds, any of those speeds you read off your airspeed indicator, they're not true airspeed. They're essentially the pressure airspeed, the pressure of the air airspeed. And so your airspeed indicator automatically compensates as you're moving up and down because it's only sensing the outside pressure. Okay, so let's take a look at this in an example. This is us flying into Telluride. This is last spring. Let's show obviously our indicated airspeed is right here on the left. And then this true airspeed right here, this is ground speed. This is coming from our GPS, so it's really not a measurement of what's going on in the air at all. Our true airspeed right here, that's being calculated by the G1000. So you can look at how these two relate. You'll notice, even though it's cold, our outside air temperature is -4 Celsius. You'll notice that true airspeed is still significantly faster than our indicated airspeed, and that's because of our altitude. We're at 9,280 feet. The airport itself is at 9,070 feet. So even in the winter, when we're landing in Aspen or Telluride or even in Denver, the density altitude is still much higher than sea level. Our true airspeeds on landing are much higher than our indicated airspeed. But again, we're just going to fly our normal published indicated airspeed down to landing. So for the Cirrus, short or final approach should be between 80 to 85 knots. For a maximum short field effort, the POH recommends 75 or 79 knots, essentially at 50 feet on short final. And so you'll see we're going to aim for 79 knots. You can see today with a -4-degree temperature, our true airspeed is 100 knots. And as I start to walk my power out and reduce for 79, okay, here I am right there. That's 79 knots. Okay, now you can see my true airspeed's 92 knots. And we touch down right there. 65 knots indicated, 76 knots true. So you can see we're almost 10 knots faster than indicated. But essentially, if you look at that, for our weight, 65 knots is right about our stalling speed. So we're touching down essentially right at stalling speed. Now let's watch the same landing again in the summer. You can see the OAT significantly higher. It's about 22 degrees Celsius higher, 18 degrees. Our true airspeed now is 104 knots, so about 4 knots faster, even though we're still flying our published short final speed, or our published final approach speed of 85 knots. And as we fly in, you'll see me slow down to 79. Okay, so that's 79 knots. Our true airspeed is well faster now at 97 knots. And we touched down right there at 69 indicated, 84 true. So let's just compare those two. When we start, our true airspeed in winter is 100 knots with an indicated airspeed of around 85. In the summer, it's faster, 104 knots with a true airspeed or with an indicated airspeed of 85. In the summer, our short final indicated airspeed, 79, gives us a true airspeed of 97. Looking at that now in the winter, again 79, we're about 5 knots slower, 92. So what this goes to show is when density altitude changes, you don't need to change your final approach airspeeds. You just want to fly your published, POH-driven airspeeds for landing. So those speeds are going to vary based off weight. They're going to vary based off flap configuration. And then finally, they're going to vary if you've got gusty wind, you may add 50% of the gust factor. But those are really the only things that should change your final approach airspeeds. Okay, last thing I'm going to show you, we'll go back to this. You'll notice when we were flying in winter, you'll notice that we actually touched down at 65 knots indicated. During the summer, we touched down at 69. And the reason is that during the summer, we had Sarah Tolucci, Cirrus Sarah flying with us, so we had an extra person in the airplane. And that just goes to show the airplane essentially was just a little bit heavier, but just that extra weight changes our touchdown speed. The weather doesn't change it in terms of temperature. The density altitude doesn't change it. But just adding a little bit of weight into that airplane can significantly change your final touchdown speed. Okay, looks like we've got a question.
And you actually kind of answered it already. So John wanted to know this. So obviously, winter or summer, we're flying the same indicated airspeeds all the time. But he said, how would I adjust my speed based on aircraft weight? If I'm lower than max gross, what should I do? Do I change my knots indicated airspeed?
That's a really good question. One of the challenges we have in the Cirrus is that our landing performance is only published at maximum gross weight. So the POH does not give us an option to adjust our final approach speed for a lower weight. Now, what that really means is if I fly that final approach speed, I'm going to float just a little bit farther. And if you notice, that actually happened. We picked up a little bit of a tailwind in the winter as we went into touchdown, but we were also lighter, so we floated a little bit farther. So the first thing I'm going to say is look in your POH and see if they publish landing speeds at two different weights. Many aircraft will publish a landing speed or a short final speed at both maximum gross weight and then typically at a weight that's just a little above basic empty weight. And you can interpolate between those two weights to find your current landing weight. That's what you should use for your landing speed. If your POH doesn't give you any guidance for landing at slower weights, you have a couple options. Option number one is to fly your published POH speeds. And that's what I recommend. If you're landing on an extremely short field and you're going to need to bring the aircraft in even slower, you may need to reduce a knot or two below those published POH speeds if they're only published at max gross and you happen to be below that. The problem is you don't know where that aircraft is going to start stalling, so you have to feel that out. And the best recommendation I can give you there, if you need that maximum performance landing effort, if you find yourself floating, take it around, take 2 knots off your final approach speed, attempt it again, take another couple knots off to your final approach speed again if you need to, and attempt it again. You'll notice backcountry pilots typically use a lot of feel and control pressures to try to determine when the aircraft's right about ready to land. As you move into some larger and heavier airplanes, they can be harder to feel because you don't always have that same control feedback, and we're not as proficient at that maneuver. So I'm always careful about reducing too far below those POH published speeds because you can quickly get yourself onto the backside of the power curve. But again, if you really do need, if you're floating, best thing to do is take it around the pattern, take a knot or two off, and once you find that perfect final approach speed, keep an eye on your weight and the aircraft's configuration. because now that's a good final approach speed for your weight and that aircraft configuration, and you can use that in the future when you're flying at the same configuration and weight. Again, the only other thing that I would say is then keep in mind if you have gusty winds, you need to increase by half the gust factor. Okay, next question.
Okay, we got one more question here around landings before we move on, and it comes from Karen, and she says this. It's been windy and gusty this fall, and I'm struggling with my landings. Should I adjust my final speed when it's windy?
Okay, so that's that last caveat that I said, and you're definitely not alone. I think that transition, especially in the fall and in the spring, when you end up, part of it, we get all these gusty winds in the fall and the spring, and part of it is that you've got really cold air masses mixed with really warm air masses, which tends to create a lot of very gusty winds. And that kind of bleeds off into the deep winter and also during the summer. So we always kind of tend to move from, calm winds to gusty winds, lots of crosswinds, and back to calm winds, so it's hard to stay proficient. One of the things to remember, the general rule, you'll find it in every FAA handbook and in most airline books all over, is that you should add half of the gust factor to your indicated final approach speed. So if the winds are 10, gust 20, you have a 10 knot gust factor. You divide that in half, so that's 5 knots, and you'd add that to your final approach speed. So let's say your final approach speed is 79 knots. I'd add 5 knots to that. That gets me to 84. That's my new final approach speed. And I'd add those 5 knots kind of all the way up. So I'm, 5 knots faster than normal, compensating for those 10 knot gusts. The other thing to keep in mind is that works for standard gusts. As you get into significant low-level wind shear, and you start to see things like aircraft reporting, losses of 15 knots on final, you may want to increase beyond those gust factors. So I'll typically, if I've got a recent wind shear report from an aircraft of my size or larger, I'll make sure that I'm adding typically at least half of their wind shear loss. And that's simply because sometimes the ground gusts don't accurately reflect what's happening higher above the ground. You have different layers of air. And so listening to those wind shear reports and keeping that in mind is also very important. The last thing I always tell people is that's also a signal. When you see larger and heavier aircraft, especially general aviation business aircraft, so turboprops, light jets reporting 10 knots, 15 knot loss of airspeed on final, that's going to be exacerbated as you get into lighter aircrafts. Even a heavy single like a Cirrus, 3,600 pounds, we're still going to typically see more effect from that wind shear. And as you move into lighter and lighter aircraft, that gets greater and greater. So then you start to evaluate, is that a safe airport to land at? But again, to recap, half of the published gust factor, gusting to 10 knots, or gusting 10 knots, add 5 knots to your final approach speed, and then also keep in mind if low-level wind shear is reported, I'm going to add some of that onto my final approach speed as well. Okay, if that's the last question on landings, Colin, you want to take us to number 2?
Yeah, here we go. So our second common question is this. Why is it harder to start my airplane when it's cold outside? I fly a carbureted Cessna 172.
Okay, we see this a lot, and actually Colin and I saw this quite a bit. We both started teaching at the University of North Dakota, where we were flying at the time. It was a Piper Warrior PA-28161. They had the 0320, right, Colin? Or 0360?
0320.
0320. Yep. 160 horsepower engine, 0320. It was carbureted. It had a single primer point. And of course, in North Dakota, oftentimes it got really, really cold. We would keep the airplanes preheated, but as that engine started to get down again towards the 40 degree or freezing point, they could be nearly impossible to start. And it could get very, very frustrating. Fuel injected airplanes and big carbureted airplanes, high performance carbureted aircraft, are sometimes easier to start. But your traditional training aircraft with a carbureted engine, it can really be a bear if it's cold. Okay, and it all comes down to the fact that while we think of avgas as highly flammable, and it is, it actually takes a little bit to get avgas to turn from a liquid into a vapor. And the colder avgas gets, the less it wants to vaporize. So again, it's funny, everybody talks about, man, jet fuel, that's volatile. Well, not really, it's kerosene. Avgas is much more volatile than jet fuel, okay? And if you had a puddle of avgas sitting somewhere, do not try this, but if you had a puddle of avgas sitting somewhere and you threw a match into it, chances are most of the time the match would just go out. And the reason is there wouldn't be enough of a vapor barrier on top or vapor formation on top of that puddle to actually ignite. In fact, when fuel on the ground burns, it's not the liquid fuel that's burning, it's the vapors on top of it. Okay, so again, the colder avgas gets, the harder it is to turn it from a liquid into a vapor. So now let's take a look. That's our goal. The engine needs to do that. The last thing you want in your induction system after you've moved downstream from your carburetor is liquid fuel. All you want is vaporized fuel. So let's take a look how a simple engine primes. We'll go to the iPad. What you can see here, this is a very typical side of a light training aircraft, 4-cylinder light training aircraft. It's typically got one primer point. And that primer point may be located in the induction manifold itself, or it may be located just prior to one of the cylinder's intake valves. And again, on a lot of light training aircraft, only one primer line is supplied. As you move into bigger and bigger airplanes, you get an improved priming system through an STC, you'll start priming multiple points. But on your basic training aircraft, oftentimes one point is primed in the induction manifold. So the problem you run into, if we go back to that, when you pump the primer, what you're doing is you can think of it's just essentially like a spray bottle. It's spraying droplets of fuel into the air. And hopefully what that fuel will do is start to vaporize, okay? Now, when it's really cold, it won't vaporize as well. And some of that liquid just falls and kind of sits on the bottom of that intake portion of the induction manifold. The other problem that you run into is when you crank your starter, there's one cylinder that's going to open first, and then another one, and another one, and another one. But that cylinder isn't necessarily the one that's the closest to the primer charge. So it actually could take a couple cylinders opening and closing before that primer charge is sucked into the engine. And while it's sitting there in the cold air in your induction manifold, it may be devaporizing. It's just liquid fuel now sitting on the bottom of that intake manifold. And again, liquid fuel will not burn. Okay, so that leads to the second problem. So now we prime like 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 15 times because everybody's really frustrated, which is an awful idea. And we end up with this scenario right here. There is liquid fuel in the intake manifold, and now that liquid fuel is also sitting inside of the cylinder. Now, not only can this cause an engine fire, it also is flooding the engine, and in the winter, it makes it really hard to start. Because again, at least during the summer, you've got temperature, you got heat that's going to help vaporize out that liquid. But in the winter, when that engine's cold, when the fuel is cold, it's less likely to start to vaporize. It takes a lot longer. So flooding really gets much worse. It's much harder to start a flooded engine. And then to make matters worse, is those cylinders are pumping up and down. If they have liquid fuel in there, that fuel actually starts to splash up onto the spark plug tips. Okay, and so when it does that, Colin's going to switch over to the iPad here. So there we go. So you can see as this fuel starts splashing up here, now these get wet. And again, we like to think of fuel as flammable, but really the liquid fuel is a bit of an insulator. So as soon as those spark plugs are wet with fuel, it's harder for them to spark. If they do spark, it's a weaker spark. They don't always spark all the time. So what I'm getting at here is when you flood your cylinders in the winter, which is more likely because the fuel wants to stay liquid and not vapor, then that starts splashing around in your cylinders and gets your spark plugs wet, and they don't want to spark, and essentially the engine itself, it just sits there and cranks over. That's why it's so hard to start. Okay, looks like we got a question.
Okay, so Jack's got a question that's actually pretty on point with what you're talking about right now. And he says, what should I do with my throttle on a cold start after I've primed?
I think Colin kind of picked that one because that is the next slide. And we talked to a few mechanics here. It's been a little while since I've flown a single point primer carbureted airplanes. So we started calling around to several mechanics and talking to people who've been in the field for years with years and years of experience in different areas, and talked about what's better or what's worse. One of the biggest fears we all have when we're starting in the cold is we don't want to get that throttle up too high and over rev the engine, because the engine is cold, and if the oil's cold, it's going to add some wear and tear to the engine. Okay, so first of all, what we're assuming with the rest of our discussion for right now is that the engine has been properly preheated. And that either means that it's just coming off of a flight so it's warm, or you've had it on in a heated hangar and quickly pulled it out. And when they do pull an airplane out of a heated hangar, we always talk about this, never have them pull it ahead of time. It's better to delay your departure because you've got to wait for the line to pull the airplane out than it is to have them pull a warm airplane out of a heated hangar. It sits on the ground for 2 hours, and now you might as well not have even had it in the heated hangar because the airplane's cold soaked again. Okay, so we're going to assume that the engine's warm because it's either been plugged in if it's got a Tannis heater, you've been running a preheater on it properly so the engine's warm there, or it just came out of a heated hangar. In those cases, the engine itself should be warm enough and the oil should be warm enough that it can safely operate as you start it up. In old oil, you go back in the 50s and 60s, we used single weight oil. So maybe SAE 100. Well, now we use multi-viscosity oil, which really just means that the oil maintains kind of its okay range of viscosity through a wide temperature range. And what that really means is it's okay to let the engine run a little bit if the engine is at proper temperature once it's started. Now, this doesn't mean that you should start the airplane up so it spins up to 2,000 RPMs right away. But normally when I started, I like it about 800 to 1,000. That's what I'm targeting. If it goes up a couple hundred more, no big deal if the engine has been properly warmed. So the reason this is very important is because in the winter, we tend to get frustrated that the airplane won't start and we overprime. Okay, so keep in mind now we've added a lot of liquid fuel. And then the other problem that we've got is we don't want that engine to rev up much, so we pull the carburetor throttle back. And what that means is that there's very little airflow that ends up going through the carburetor. So let's take a look at it right here. This is a closed carburetor. And as I start to open it, now you can see we get a little airflow that's essentially, flowing around these edges right here. Okay, so the problem is if that engine is almost completely closed, you're really getting almost no airflow. And again, not only is your primer line having a hard time vaporizing fuel, but your updraft carburetor is having a hard time vaporizing the cold fuel as well. The fuel has to vaporize and then flow up and into the intake manifold on most carbureted training aircraft. And it's less effective when it's cold at vaporizing air or vaporizing fuel into the air. So when that throttle is barely open, you're really not able to get any fuel into the air at all. So really what most mechanics say is that you want to crack your throttle open a little bit more than you would in the summer to allow a little bit of air and fuel to make it through. And you typically want to try to prime the airplane the same or a little bit less when you're using single point priming. The general rule when we look at cold starts that fail, the engine is overprimed and the throttle is too closed. So the carburetor isn't able to effectively vaporize fuel into the air and send that up the induction manifold, and the overpriming has resulted in a whole bunch of liquid fuel just sitting around in the intake manifold. So again, as we start to get into cold weather operations, just keep that in mind. Pilots tend to overprime and keep the throttle way too far back, which essentially cuts off the fuel-air mixture from the carburetor. Okay, next question.
Okay, we got another good question related to these cold starts, and Donna says this: does the carburetor heat help in the vaporization of fuel in the winter during start?
Really good question. It doesn't, and that's because your carburetor heat system is taking heat from the engine's exhaust system. Okay, so essentially, it's just a heat exchanger taking the hot exhaust gases, which are 13, 14, maybe 1600 degrees, coming off of that cylinder, warming the air around the exhaust manifold, and then piping that air into the carburetor. And so the problem is during start, your exhaust manifold is still ice cold. It actually takes, a little bit, a few minutes. You got to let the engine start to warm up before that carb heat is going to be able to generate warm air. Keep in mind, once the engine is fully running, your EGTs will stabilize out. They're not going to be super hot at low power, but your EGTs stabilize very, very quickly. But again, that exhaust manifold itself then needs time to warm up the air inside that carb heat area and to send that into the carburetor. So on the ground after start or during start, your carb heat's going to do nothing. It's really an in-flight tool or a warm engine tool. Once the engine's up and running, that's the only time that you can use it. One of the other things that I'm just going to jump into really quickly here is proper preheating, because it's something that most pilots don't think very much about. One of the big questions is, when do I need to preheat? It depends on the engine's manufacturer. And you can actually look it up. If it's not in your POH, both Continental and Lycoming have service letters or bulletins that talk about when they recommend engine preheating, and other engine manufacturers will do the same. Continental generally says for Continental engines that if the engine has been exposed to 20 Fahrenheit or colder air for more than 2 hours, the airplane needs to be properly preheated. Lycoming says on most of their engine models, if it's been cold soaked at 10 degrees Fahrenheit, unless it's a Dash 76 engine when they recommend it for 20 degrees. But one of the general rules that I use is freezing. If the airplane has been exposed to freezing air or colder, I'm going to preheat the engine. And on large engines, I'm going to preheat it at 40 degrees or colder, because preheating can't hurt the engine. If you're using a plug-in Tannis heater, so essentially you've got a little place for an electrical plug, typically in the cowl, and then you plug that into a ground power, like an outlet on the ramp. You see these a lot in colder climates. Those heaters should really be left on for several hours. If you look at your model of Tannis heater, they'll tell you the warm-up time, but typically overnight's good, but at least 4 to 6 hours to get the engine up to temperature. And those heaters, if they're properly installed, not only heat the oil sump, but they also heat the cylinders in the engine block, so they make sure the entire engine is warm. If you're going to use a preheater, first of all, you want to make sure it's a legit aviation preheater. That you're not just taking a fan and like a garage heater and trying to blow air into the engine. And the reason for that is that a preheater, if it exposes the engine to too hot of air, can actually start to melt the baffling and the insulation on the wires and the plastics inside your engine cowl. So you can do quite a bit of damage with an improperly managed engine preheater. The general rule is you want to run that preheater for 5 to 10 minutes at a time, and then you want to check the inside of the engine by touching it to feel that A, the engine is retaining heat, and that B, that you're not overheating the baffles or any of the wires. So if you have like a front mounted alternator, the wires coming off that, you want to make sure that you're not overheating those. And keep in mind, the amount of time you're going to need to preheat will depend on how cold soaked that engine is. You don't just want to get the outside of the cylinders warm. You need to give the engine enough time so that the actual core of the engine is warm itself, because there's oil lines, little, essentially, paths that the oil flows through the engine and through the cylinders that lubricates the engine. And while the outside of the engine could be warm, the inside could be stone cold, and that oil is congealed. And so you won't realize it when you start it. You'll have no indication. You'll start the engine and you've got this congealed oil in there. It'll start normally, it's running normally, but there are parts of the engine that are completely unlubricated until the engine gets up to temperature. And that will cause catastrophic failure, which could occur hours down the line. It could occur, after another 30 minutes of operation or another 4 or 5 hours of operation. So preheating is exceptionally important. One of the general rules they say is when an engine has been properly heated, it'll be warm. When you take the preheater off, it will stay warm. If you touch it again 30 seconds later, it'll stay warm. And the reason is, if the inside of the engine is really cold and it's just the outside part of the metal that's hot, that cold part will suck all the heat away right away, and the engine will turn cold again. But if you take the preheat off and wait a little bit and feel it, and yep, that engine still stays really, really warm, that generally means that the engine has been warmed all the way through. And again, no offense to line operations or ramp, but as a pilot, it's your responsibility to preheat the engine. We hear horror stories. Well, I let ramp do it. I thought they knew how to use it. They're not trained on how to preheat your engine. Many of them know how to turn on and off the preheater, and that is it. And so as a pilot, it's really up to you to make sure you're doing it properly. And if you're not sure, I would try to find a mechanic who can help you out, because they're going to have a lot better knowledge on that engine than necessarily just anybody working around the airport. Again, it's no offense to someone working on the ramp. It's just that proper preheat is something that people just really don't do a lot, and can cause some serious engine nightmares. Okay, last but not least, fuel injected and multi-primed engines tend to start easier in the cold, and here's why. First of all, fuel injectors, while we still suffer from the same problem of cold fuel not wanting to vaporize, they do prime. A fuel injected system will prime each cylinder. So whatever the first cylinder open is, when you crank, that cylinder will get fresh primed fuel. On a large carbureted engine, they typically have several prime points. Typically not each cylinder, but maybe if it's a 6-cylinder engine, they may have 3 or 4 prime points. Then the other advantage that you get to with more modern, some of the newer engine designs, some of the newer engines coming out of Lycoming and Continental, they're designed to prevent flooding. So they may have little fuel bowls inside the intake valve or intake areas right in front of the intake valves that catch liquid fuel and prevent that from going into the cylinders themselves. So some of those newer engines, some of the larger engines start easier. It's just that they have more priming points, and some of the new designs are a little better at catching pooled fuel. But we're all stuck with the same fact. When fuel is cold, it really doesn't want to vaporize. Okay, let's go on to the third question. Colin?
Okay, third and final question of tonight is this. What do the braking action reports mean? I saw 544 at my airport.
Okay, every year I have to remind myself, you really should know them summer and winter, because during the summer we're still dealing with wet runways, and wet runways can cause braking action problems just as bad as snow, slush, or ice can. Maybe not quite as bad, but definitely can cause some braking action problems. But again, as fall, winter comes around, I got to go back through them again, because trying to remember what all those numbers mean, it can get a little bit complicated. But it is a lot easier today than it used to be. First of all, as pilots, we usually use either the braking action is good, medium, poor, or nil for doesn't exist, okay? And you may also hear fair in there. You could call that medium. To me, when I say braking action fair, that's medium. The new verbiage is good, medium, poor, and nil, or no braking action. And when we look at that, we used to have mu values, which were essentially friction readings. And if you were in a large transport category aircraft, you would go put that weight and your aircraft's landing weight, the mu values and all that, and it would help you recalibrate your braking distance. But there were different systems that took different measurements, and there were different kinds of measurements, and you really had to know what you were doing as you added them in, and it resulted in some confusion in transport category aircraft and some incidents and accidents. So the FAA has moved to a much simpler model. It's a 0 through 6 scale. People go 6, I've never heard of 6. And that's because if there's no contamination, that's 6. The runway is not contaminated, braking action is normal, okay, it won't be reported. But as soon as a part of the braking action goes below uncontaminated, now you're going to see a report. And we're going to look at some of these reports. They're either going to be in NOTAMs, you'll hear them across ATIS, Tower may read them out to you as well. They're going to give you 3 numbers. So they basically just divide the runway up into thirds. The first third, the middle, and the last third. And so, on a perfect day, or a near perfect day with just a little light dusting of snow, you may hear 555. As the weather deteriorates, that could go to 333. If the middle of the runway is fairly clear and the 2 ends are really icy, that could go to like 131. So again, it's essentially the first third, the middle third, and the last third. Okay, let's take a look at what those numbers mean. 6 is the best number. And we don't see it very often because typically 6 is not reported. So that's 6 right here. 6 just means the runway is dry. And so this column here is deacceleration, braking, or directional control observation. And this is what, as a pilot, we would typically report. Okay, so 5, you're going to see that a lot. 5 typically means that the runway has got frost or it's wet. And if it's wet, it's got an 1/8 inch, 3 millimeters or less of water. So not very wet, just a little bit wet. And then either an 1/8 inch or less of slush, dry, or wet snow. What that really means is that brakes will still work normally and directional control is normal. Pilots would typically report this as braking action good. So 5 means there's something contaminating the runway, but as a pilot, as we start applying the brakes and as we try to control the aircraft throughout the roundout, we probably do not notice any contamination or effect on the aircraft at all. Okay, let's take a look at the next one. So the next one is 4. So -15 Celsius or colder, it's going to be compacted snow. What it means is braking deceleration or directional control is somewhere between good to medium. So, okay, what's medium? Let's take a look at 3. 3, okay, so that's going to be braking condition medium. That means deceleration is noticeably reduced. For wheel braking and directional control is noticeably reduced. So when we talk about braking action 3, what it means is we can tell that the runway is contaminated. We have to work to maintain directional control, and we notice a longer ground roll. We can tell that the aircraft is no longer decelerating normally. That's 3. So 4 would mean maybe you're getting a little bit of that, but not much. You think you've got it, but you're really not feeling it a lot. By the time you get to medium or 3, you can tell that the airplane's not decelerating and you as it normally would, and you need to work more to directionally control the aircraft. Typically, that's a runway that is slippery when wet. So for example, a non-grooved asphalt runway that could, when it's wet, be slippery. Dry snow or wet snow sitting on top of compacted snow would typically cause that. And then more than an 1/8 inch, 3 millimeters of dry snow or wet snow, or compacted snow if it's warmer than -15 degrees Celsius outside. Okay, number 2. Braking direction or directional control is between medium and poor. Okay, so what's medium or what is poor? Poor is braking deceleration is significantly reduced for the wheel braking effort applied, or directional control is significantly reduced. That's poor. That would be condition 1, and in this case that is caused by ice, okay, or generally caused by ice. So again, when we said 3, medium means we could tell either that we're not decelerating as fast, or they both could happen, or just one of them. The airplane's a little bit harder to control the direction. Now, as we get into poor, it's a significant change. It is a significantly longer ground roll, and we work significantly harder to maintain directional control down the runway. Okay, and then finally, 0. Braking deceleration is minimal to non-existent for wheel braking, or directional control is uncertain. I think everybody at some point in time in training has felt like their directional control was uncertain. Hopefully you had an instructor along, but this is one of those scenarios where you're going down the runway and you realize you no longer can directionally control the airplane. That would be braking action 0. Okay, looks like we got a question.
Okay, so we've got a couple questions related to cold weather, not necessarily the runways themselves, but I thought these fit in pretty well here. And we'll start off with Jose's question, and that is, what pre-flight procedures do you guys recommend when operating under freezing temperatures?
Oh, that's a great question, Jose. So number 1, it really depends on where the airplane has been and what it's been doing. For me, number 1, if the airplane's coming out of a heated hangar, and I know heated hangars are expensive when you're on a cross country, they can vary anywhere from $50 a night to $300 a night. We almost always try to fit the airplane into a heated hangar because it solves so many of these problems. But when we're pre-flighting or post-flighting in the winter, there's a few things we're really looking for. Number 1 is any ice contaminating the airplane anywhere. Okay, so we need to get rid of snow off the airplane. That's a challenge in and of itself because not all airplanes you want to broom. Brooming will scratch the wings, so if there's a nice paint job on the airplane, you can really mess that up when you broom it. And the best way to remove snow or ice from an airplane is to tow it into a heated hangar and let it warm up and melt off. That is always the best way. I know that when you're dealing with some training aircraft, the wings don't look that great anyways. The one I learned in, I think the wings already had been sandblasted, so no one would have worried about us brooming the snow off the top of the airplane. But the one thing you cannot broom off is frost. You just simply can't get all of the frost all the way down to the point. Even polished smooth isn't good enough. You really just want the airplane decontaminated. So that's one thing I'm really looking for during pre-flight. There is one thing that I carry with me. It's a bit of investment, but you can find it in an FBO. I carry a spray bottle of TKS. So TKS is a de-icing fluid that runs through like the Cirrus de-icing system, some of the Cessna and Caravan de-icing systems. It's a liquid. It's not what they spray from the trucks. That's different. It's a liquid that oozes out of the front of our wings. So if you look at a Cirrus, if you look at, I think some of the 350-400s have them, don't they, Colin?
I believe so, yeah.
Yep, they've got them. The Caravans, the newer Caravans have TKS wings. They look like a metal edge. They don't get hot, they just ooze this goo. You can get that, put it in a spray bottle, and I'll spray that along the wings to remove any snow or frost. The beauty about TKS is it's a de-icing agent, so it clears it off completely. You want to be careful about using glycol, the stuff they spray from the trucks. That can be bad for your air filters if it's ingested into the engine. And if you do have weeping wings for a TKS system, that can clog the pores. So generally, we really don't want to use that. But I'll carry a spray bottle of TKS. If you don't have TKS and the aircraft's not de-icing equipped, and you're not worried about the paint job, your mileage may vary, you can always carry anti-icing windshield washer fluid, like you would put in your car in North Dakota, and you could put that in a bottle and spray that on the wings, and oftentimes that will remove frost as well, and then I just wipe the wings dry with a cloth. Okay, so frost and ice accumulation is a big thing that I'm looking for. I'm really checking those static ports and the pitot tubes to make sure that if the airplane is thawed out and then water starting to run down it and then refrozen, that those ports haven't frozen over with ice. The same thing as I'm checking all the hinge joints and all that, making sure that ice hasn't worked its way in there. And then, moving past to the wheel wells, that's another big part. We start to see contamination. Wheel wells in the bottom of the flaps, they'll get ice and snow contamination from slush, typically when taxiing. That can actually back up if you have wheel pants and cause damage. So you make sure that those are completely free of ice. And the same thing, the bottom of the flaps, you really want to make sure those are completely free of ice and snow as well. And then the other thing is always making sure that that engine has been properly preheated. And the important thing is once preheating is done, you should immediately start the engine. Once you've determined that that airplane has been properly preheated, it's time to start it. You don't even want to wait 5 minutes. So that means pre-flight's done, planning's done, aircraft's loaded while you're preheating. And then once you've determined, yep, the airplane's properly preheated, now you take the heat off, tow it out of the hangar, unplug it from the Tannis, whatever it is, and at that point, now you're ready to start. Last thing, and I'll mention on this, just something to think about when you're pre-flighting, preheating the cabin. Tannis heaters will not do that, but you can, because they don't have elements in the cabin, but you can take the preheating hose from a ground heater and put it into the cabin. That's a good idea for a couple reasons. It's better for passengers. It's nice to get into a warm cabin. But at the same time, even electronic avionics don't function well when they're extremely cold. And if you've got any spinning gyros, that grease, as it gets cold, just doesn't lubricate well, and so it causes a lot of wear and tear. So I will typically run that preheating hose into the footwell and make sure the instrument panel itself is warmed up. I don't jam it up behind because I don't want to melt anything there. I'll just put it in the footwell. The heat will rise in and warm up the instruments. I usually leave it there for about 5, maybe 10 minutes, get the instrument panel warm so that, again, when I pull that out, we're ready to go. Okay, next question.
Okay, we got time for one more question here. We do have quite a few more. We're going to try to get to those in the chat at the end here as well. But the last question we've got up here on the board is this. It comes from Damon, and he says, okay, so you guys have a nice aircraft with anti-ice, de-ice. Tell us what your personal limits are for takeoff in winter weather. He's got some examples here. Snow, cold, precipitation, freezing rain, or other freezing precipitation.
Damon, great question. So first of all, I actually just switched to a new, I digitally log and paper log, and I just switched to another Jeppesen ProFlight, told out my old logbook and moved over and, looked at all the aircraft types. And we fly Cirrus now. It's a fantastic airplane, but still most of my time is in twins and singles that had, analog instrumentation and no de-icing system. And depending on the airplane, my limits have changed. Right now, and obviously on my proficiency at different times, which changes. Your proficiency doesn't always go up, and it kind of goes up and down depending on how much flying you've been doing. But right now in the Cirrus SR22 Turbo, we're equipped for known ice operations, and it's a twin turbocharger, a single engine with 2 turbochargers, so it's got a reasonable amount of power. Number one, that aircraft cannot take off or operate in freezing precipitation, either reported or suspected. So freezing fog, freezing drizzle, and the way I could identify that is number one, when I'm going out to the airport, just looking at what's going on around me. So anything like that, I'm not going to take the airplane off in. Number two, nothing can be adhering to the wings. So when we talk about things like heavy or moderate snow, I'm typically not departing in that either. There is a bit of an exception to light to moderate snow in extreme cold environments where I can tell the snow visually is not adhering to the wings. So if I'm in North Dakota and it's 30 below and I kind of got these ice crystals, snow kind of falling off, but I can tell as I'm taxiing, it's so dry, it's not sticking to anything. I'm not as worried about that. And then the other things as far as limits go, my weather limits, wind limits on runways go down very quickly as soon as I move below 5. Okay, so typically I feel fairly comfortable with strong crosswinds, well above the crosswind component. Once we start to get down into that 3 and below braking action, a 10 knot crosswind component is all I'll accept. I will not land or take off from runways that are below 3. As you get into like 2, 1, and 0, no way I'm going to touch it, unless it was an emergency. Because at that point in time, when you get down to poor, essentially the airplane is hard to control, and you're at risk of running into something. So I'm really going to pull down my crosswind. And again, even though as a pilot I may feel proficient in killing the crosswind, and I may feel like the airplane can handle it, you have to consider the fact that the runway itself, you just may not have enough friction to get the airplane stopped. And so, in that 5-4 range, I'm going to start to pull down my crosswind. Once I get to 3, you really don't want any crosswind. Anything below that, I'm not landing at all. And then the other thing that I'm very, very picky about is keeping the engine warm and doing long run-ups and long taxis. I am in no rush to depart when the airplane's cold. So again, that really picks up with stuff like snow. If it's snowing and it's going to start to adhere to my wings, I'm going to be in trouble because I want the engine to come up to temperature before I get out to the runway and throw up the power. So I got to sit sometimes in the run-up area with that engine just kind of idling at a little bit increased idle to get everything warm. If it's snowing out, it adheres to the wings, I got to go back. So again, nothing adhering to the wings, no freezing anything. If I suspect it, I'm definitely not going for it, and I'm cutting back my crosswinds as soon as I'm below 5, and 3, essentially no crosswind. Anything less than 3, I'm not going at all. Okay. Colin, what do you think? You fly with me most of the time. You think that's you feel safe at those limits?
Yeah, I think that's all really good. Really for us, we really err on the side of caution, especially when it comes to winter weather. We are never interested in pushing it because, it's much better to be on the ground than being up in the air and wishing you were back sitting on the ramp.
And I mean, as instructors, obviously, if you go to an airline and you'll hear this concept, that's the training way to fly, here's the line way to fly. So I know sometimes our limits sound like the training way to fly. But a lot of it for us is everybody's probably scared themselves in an airplane at some point in time. And I realize you knew you were going to do it before it happened. You didn't know you were going to scare yourself that day, but you knew you were doing something that was a little bit riskier. And over time, it's better to stay somewhere else, spend an extra night on a cross country, or divert into another airport than it is to come back here. In fact, last example, it wasn't even winter, but we were on our way back from the COPA, Cirrus Owners and Pilots Association migration in New Orleans. And the winds in Metro were 30 gusting to 40. And then it kind of died to like 38 gusts. And during the day, I'll do that there. But it was night. and there was just no way. There's low-level wind shear. There's way too much terrain, which doesn't. I'm not afraid of hitting the train landing on the runway 30, but just the wind shear you can get there makes an approach very, very difficult. And I don't do that many night operations, so we sat down and flew into Centennial, had perfect landing dinner, and sat around watching the clock at the airport until the AWOS dropped down. And then once it dropped down, I think we landed, what was it, maybe 18 or 20, Colin?
Yeah, it was down to, I believe, gusting to 18 when we took off. Then by the time we actually got there, it was like 8 knots. So it really died down.
You know, and again, it made the trip a little longer. We even talked about, just getting the hotel next to the airport and making that last 7-mile flight, I think is all it is. It's 7 minutes. But again, it's something I don't get to do a lot, land at night in gusty, gusty winds. And so it's something that I'm not going to do, especially at the end of a long trip. Okay, that's all the time we've got for tonight. In about 4 minutes, we're going to have our Boldmethod IFR live. And tonight we're going to talk about how to find cloud tops. So if you're instrument rated or even a non-instrument rated pilot, and you want to learn how to figure out where the cloud tops are, we're going to talk about 3 or 4 ways to find those using forecasts and observations. That's one of our biggest struggles as we start to fly piston aircraft that can get above 10,000 feet but can't get into 30,000 foot areas. You're always trying to get out of the ice and out of the clouds, and you're trying to figure out if you've got enough power and altitude to do it. So we're going to talk about how to find that. That starts in 4 minutes. Otherwise, we hope to see you in 2 weeks. Thanks very much. Have a great night.